Today we're going to be discussing the rest of the Constitutional Convention that was held in Philadelphia, set originally to begin on what day? May 14th, 1787. But that wasn't to be, and as we mentioned in our last lesson, even though it was set for May the 14th, 1787, only 2 states showed up. And which states were those? Virginia and Pennsylvania, since that's the state it was in. And it was almost 2 weeks before the convention started, but did they just sit around waiting for it to start? No. Madison was busy writing what has become known as the 15 Virginia Resolves, which really formed the agenda for the convention. And it's kind of nice that a meeting of this magnitude have some direction, and so Madison was the one who gave it direction. As we said, these are called Virginia's 15 Resolves. I want you to look on page 155 and 156. We're going to go through a few of Madison's suggestions as he wrote them, handed them out, and then they began to go through them. Some of the things they rejected and some they accepted. But there were 41 major proposals in all, and you should know some of the major points that they considered and whether they accepted them or rejected them. So on page 155, and you can look over this and determine if there's anything you want to talk about, but I want you to look at number 2, page 155. This is the second suggestion in the 15 resolves. The number of representatives for each state shall be proportioned according to the quotas of contributions or taxes paid. What do you think of that? Should we have the number of representatives in Congress according to the number of taxes, the amount of taxes that a state pays? So what did they do to that? Rejected it. No, not going to have it based on taxes paid. We're going to have it based on numbers, because otherwise there's way too much weight given to wealth. Look at number 8. Here's an interesting one that Madison suggested. Members shall be ineligible for re-election for a stipulated number of years after serving 1 term. You like that?
I don't understand it.
Would there be some advantages to that?
Yeah.
Well, maybe. What do we call that today?
Term limits.
Term limits. Term limits. And that's a very popular thing today. What we're going to see is the founders rejected term limits for some very interesting reasons. And I think they're reasons that are still valid today, but look at number 9. Members shall be subject to recall. What's a recall? You elect somebody and he takes office, and after a while somebody may not like him, so they actually have an election, another election. So instead of having elections every 2 years, or in other cases every 4 years, you might have an election 6 months later. What do you think of that idea?
Sounds cool.
Now there's some real disadvantage to that, and the founders talked about it, which we'll read about, and they discussed it, and they rejected the idea of recall. Look down at look at number 20. Congress can call out the federal troops against any state which does not fulfill its duties.
Uh-oh.
What do you think of that? And remember, the real emphasis, the real loyalty was to
Your state.
states. They saw this suggestion, no way. Yeah, but what if a state doesn't do what it's supposed to do? What was the solution? Call out the federal troops? No, the federal government was not to be a watchdog over the states. That was an extremely important concept to the founders. Who was supposed to solve the problem if the states weren't doing something right? The people of the states. Everybody got that? So they rejected that. How about number 21? The president should be chosen by the Congress.
No.
Okay? They discussed, probably more than anything else, at least one of the big topics of discussion was how should we elect a president? And this was one of the suggestions, and they rejected that. Look at, look at number 23. He, meaning the president, shall be ineligible to serve a second time.
What if you have like a really
In other words, you got term limits on the president, and they rejected it. See anything else there you want to talk about? 25, the president and several designated judges shall review all legislation as a council of revision. Remember this attempt at checks and balances? Had the council of censors and so forth. This was within the government. They call it a council of revision. The council should have a veto power over any objectionable legislation. Well, they say they adopted half of it because to whom did they give veto power? The president. So they adopted part of that. See that? Look down at number 34. It's an interesting one. New states shall be admitted to the Union with the approval of Congress, but the vote need not be unanimous. See, that would have been a departure from the Articles, right? Doesn't have to be unanimous. New states come in by a vote of Congress. Is that good? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they thought so, so they accepted it. Yes, that would include any new state. Look at number 39. All officers of each state shall be required to take an oath to uphold and support the new Constitution. In other words, all the loyalty as to what is supreme is the Constitution. Did they accept it?
Yep.
Yes. So those are some things the major things that are kind of interesting about Madison's suggestions that they adopted.
Don't they still take the oath?
Do they still take the oath? Absolutely. They put that right in the Constitution. We'll talk about that when we get there. It doesn't matter if you're a school board member, city council member, county commissioner, or state legislator, or president of the United States. Everybody in public office takes an oath. That is a requirement of the Constitution. Okay? So, what was the date of the beginning of the convention?
25th.
Who knows? That's correct. May the 25th, 1787, which was about 11 days after it was initially set, and the convention opens. It's also interesting that, of course, a president was chosen, and who was the president of the convention? George Washington. Everybody looked to the great general as the one. If there's anybody that can lead us through this miasma that we're about to head into, it's the great general. And so they elected him. Who was the secretary, the recorder? Do you remember this? His name was Mr. Jackson, but whom do we thank the most for the record of what happened at the convention? It isn't Mr. Jackson, it's James Madison. And Mr. Madison just took it upon himself. As a matter of fact, he asked permission to sit up front so that he could make sure that he heard everything. And it's Madison's notes at the convention that we have much more detail than anybody else's notes. Are you starting to see why James Madison is called the father of the Constitution? He wrote the agenda for the meeting. He took the notes, and he'll have some other things to do here in a minute. So Madison is the one that records all that is said. Now they had some interesting rules at the convention. Remember what some of those rules were?
They had to speak.
They had some rules that would never fly today in today's environment. What was one particular one? Ronnie?
He wanted to speak about what somebody else was saying, I had to speak to the president of...
Okay, they still do that today. They still speak to the president. There's another one that would never fly today.
These delegates only speak twice each.
Well, no, they still have that today. I'm thinking of... What?
Strict attention.
No, they knew, let me lead you into it. They knew that there was going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of mind changing here. You might have a delegate say, I think we ought to do this. And then over the next, and so the press would report, Delegate so-and-so said this, and he's holding firm with this. And all of a sudden, 2 or 3 days later, he may change his mind. Because of the discussion, because of evidence, historical evidence, or reasoning, and all of a sudden he changes his mind. How would the press treat that? How would the press treat that? Oh, he's weakening. He's flip-flopping. And what would that kind of cause people to think? This guy's weak. This guy's not standing up for us. And so what rule did they have at the convention?
Secrecy.
No press. This thing would be conducted in secret. Now, is that proper for a body like this to do? Cam?
Remarks still addressed to the president.
Yes, yeah. We'll get to that in just a minute. I ask you, what is okay about a meeting like this being conducted in secret? First of all, is this an official meeting of the government? No. It is not. This is not Congress. Congress had already met that year. And as a matter of fact, some of them were congressmen, were members of the Continental Congress. This was not an official meeting, meaning everything that came out of this was an official document. No, it wasn't. This was a meeting of great minds, of people, to try to come up with a suggestion, which then had to be what? Given to Congress. Congress had to approve it, and then eventually it went to the states. So this was not one of those official meetings. And second of all, how do you want people to judge you? On every word you say? What would you like to be judged by? Your actions. The results of what you do, isn't it? Don't you want to be judged on the results of what you do? Not on every little detail that you might do or say as you get to the results. Hey folks, leave us alone and judge us on our results. And that's the way they felt. And when we're all through, we hope to have a document that we will give to you and say, here's the best we could do. So they said, no press. In other words, they held it in secret. Okay? Another rule they had, no matter how many delegates were there from any state, how many votes per state? 1 vote per state. Now somebody mentioned, could a delegate monopolize the conversation and speak as many times as they wanted? What was another rule? You can only speak twice on any matter. And usually in parliamentary procedure you can only speak once until everybody else has had a chance to speak who wants to. Which is fair, isn't it? Okay. Also, you had to pay strict attention to what was being said. Could you be reading newspapers?
No.
No. This was specifically forbidden. You give strict attention. Well, judging from what went on at the convention, he says, can you sleep? Judging from what went on at the convention, as you'll see in the movie we're going to show you, you wouldn't sleep through that.
Would you want to?
So, strict attention. Anybody ever seen either Congress in session or maybe even the state legislature? Who went to the state legislature with me last year? Anybody in here? Now, what did we see some of them do? Were you kind of surprised? You're up there in the gallery and they're conducting official business, and what do you see these people doing? Walking around, talking to somebody else, reading something, not paying any attention to what's happening. Well, it's kind of procedural in many cases, but this certainly wasn't procedural. Everything that was to be done here was new, so pay attention, okay? And it was mentioned here also, When you address somebody, I should say, when you want to give a speech, when you want to rebut somebody's remarks, who do you address?
President.
All comments are made to the President. What does that do?
Keeps you from fighting amongst yourselves. Keep order.
Yeah. Well, admittedly, sometimes, even though that's the rule, sometimes, and you'll see this, sometimes when somebody says something that is so upsetting to somebody, somebody will stand up and
Shout at 'em.
you know, and shout at the person, but that's not the rule, and because it's the rule not to, you can be called down for it, called out of order. See, if it wasn't the rule, then it'd be hard to call them out of order. Yes?
If you didn't address the president, you addressed that particular person, they might get offended. And if you were addressing the president, you wouldn't talk the same way.
Yeah. She said you could, a person, you may offend a person. A person may feel like you're attacking the person himself. You're really attacking maybe the issue. And that's what we have to separate here. You're not attacking the person, you're attacking the issue. And if you say, Mr. President, the honorable gentleman from Virginia said this, and I respectfully disagree, and you know, you can have a little order to the debate. That's what parliamentary procedure does. Okay? Now, when I was a junior in high school, your age, I can still remember my American history textbook saying, and most of them still say it today, that the Constitution is a bundle of compromises. What we're going to learn now is the Constitution is not just a bundle of compromises. Yes, there were some compromises in the Constitution, but most items were reached by consensus. Let's discuss the difference between consensus and compromise. What's consensus? Who knows this? Consensus?
You sit down, you talk it out, and you hear both sides.
Okay, you talk it out, and does it eventually mean you come to an agreement? Yes. You may start at two different places, but you talk it out, you use historical evidence, you reason with each other, and finally people are saying, yeah, I agree with that. That's good. I'm glad you brought that out. And you come to an agreement. That's consensus. We wish everything were reached by consensus. But what's compromise?
You give a little, not give a little.
Yeah, when you don't agree, but you're forced to give a little, somebody else gives a little, in order for there to be progress made in the meeting. That's compromise. So what we want to talk about is that there were three major compromises in the Constitution. The first one being, does anybody know? Correct. What are we going to do with this ugly institution of slavery? And this was a tough problem. Now, we all need to know, how many delegates were at the convention, at least at the beginning? 55. Do you know that nearly every one of those 55 delegates knew that slavery was wrong? Even the ones from the southern states. Yeah, we know it's morally wrong. And they knew that it had to go. Eventually, we got to get rid of it. But the delegates from the southern states said, you put a prohibition of slavery into the Constitution, guess what you won't get? You won't get the southern states to ratify this thing. You can't just cut it off. Our whole economies are built on this thing. And so, give us a little time. So this was a compromise. They gave them a little time. How much time did they figure they needed? Southern states said, I think we can do it in 20 years. All right, 20 years from that time was about 1808. So they put right in the Constitution that the federal government could not prohibit the importation of slaves until the year 1808. Thinking by that time what? Southern states and all the states, any state, would get it out of their system, and the federal government could then not only prohibit the importation of slaves, but make sure that slavery was cut out of our system. What would have happened had the founders freedom formula, which did not include slavery, have happened by 1808. What could we possibly have avoided?
The Civil War.
Civil War. But once again, because the founders' wishes were not followed, their formula was not followed. Remember, cotton became king, and the cotton gin came along, and selling cotton to Europe, and all of a sudden the economics of the thing became more important than the principle of getting rid of this ugly institution. And by the way, you might be interested to know this. There was a fellow who left the Supreme Court in our day and went around giving speeches to law schools. And this is on the 200th anniversary of the writing of the Constitution. This was back in 1987. Now this is a former Supreme Court Justice of the United States. And he said the Constitution is flawed from the beginning for two reasons. One, it does not include women. I should say it does not mention women. And secondly, it does not prohibit slavery. Well, how do you answer those things? See, we need to have answers, because not too many people have answers to those things today. They just kind of jump on the bandwagon and say, yeah, it was flawed from the beginning. I ask you, does the Constitution mention women? Does it? Does it mention women? No. No. Who else doesn't it mention? Men. What? It doesn't? No. Constitution doesn't mention men. Are you kidding me? Doesn't mention women, doesn't mention men. And this is another genius of this document. It is gender neutral. A person must be 25 years of age to be a representative. A person must be 30 to be a senator. A person. See this language? This is the genius of this document. Just another one little genius. Yeah, it doesn't mention women, but they don't tell you the rest of the story. That it doesn't mention men also. They're trying to get you worked up that women are somehow left out of the Constitution. No. And the other thing, that it doesn't prohibit slavery, this Chief Justice either didn't know his history, or you have to say he was trying, maybe he had another agenda. He was trying to make a point that was really not a valid point. You understand that? So, okay, what was the second major compromise was representation in the House and the Senate. James Madison, as you'll see on the video, A More Perfect Union that we'll show you here in a little bit, wanted and felt like, as many of them did, that both the House and the Senate should be represented by population. Well, would the large states like that? Oh yes. Would the small states like that? No. And so you remember the great compromise that finally came about, where the House of Representatives is by what? Population, and the Senate is by, or represents, the states originally. Okay? And then the third compromise is whether the federal government should have the power to regulate interstate commerce. See, the problem was you had states treating each other as foreign countries, meaning they would set up what on their borders? If you wanted to go to another state, what did you have to go through? Customs, and pay tariff on what you brought in, or even on your person. This was a way of states raising money. So you have states setting up artificial boundaries. Well, if you're going to have a great big union of free people who travel a lot to different states, how would you like to always have to pay a fee, a tariff, and so forth going into another state? See, this is no union. And so they said the only entity that can enforce no tariffs, no customs between states is the federal government. So they compromised and said, okay, the federal government, we will give them that authority to ensure the free flow of commerce between states. Okay? Those were the three major compromises in the document. And as we said, all other items were reached by consensus, which means general agreement. Down at the bottom of 158, you see the two plans, the two basic plans that were presented. We know these as the Virginia plan, which favored the large states, and the New Jersey plan, which favored the small states. You remember that from your history? I want to point out to you another person's plan. It's Hamilton's plan on page 159. First column. We just mentioned a few things about Hamilton's plan and have you tell me what this sounds like. First of all, Alexander Hamilton says, I think we should have a single executive chosen for life. You like that?
No.
Sounds like a king.
Number two, he says, I think we should have senators chosen for life. I was giving this a while back and somebody says, they are, aren't they? Meaning, they seem to be in there for life. But number three, he says, I think House of Representatives should be chosen for 3 years. And number four, governors of the states should be appointed by the federal government. Do you know enough about other countries to identify what this sounds like? It sounds like what?
It's not crown, is it?
Yeah, this is British. This is very British. And Hamilton was caught up with the British system. You have a king for life, House of Lords for life, House of Commons for a period of time, and some of the lower offices in Britain are chosen by Parliament. This is very British, yes.
Didn't you realize, with the war, what they were fighting for, to get away from the British?
The question is, didn't Hamilton realize they were trying to get away from the British system? Yes, it's interesting about Alexander Hamilton. He goes like this. He says some things sometimes very eloquently. And other times you wonder, Alex, whose side are you on here? We'll see that. And when he became Secretary of the Treasury under Washington, he did the same thing. So, I want you, have you ever been in a meeting where when somebody gave a speech, you didn't agree with it, but you were obliged to applaud? Have you ever been in that kind of a meeting where you just out of courtesy applauded? Listen to what Madison wrote about Hamilton's proposal down at the bottom of page 159, first column. Madison noted that Hamilton's plan was approved by all and supported by none. What does that mean?
People clap.
Everybody probably applauded, but nobody liked his plan. And guess what Hamilton did? He got upset and went home. And he was the last one from New York there. The others had already gone. So there was no delegation from New York. And Washington, at the end of the convention, asked him to come back so that he could at least approve the document. And so he was the only one there, and that's why New York only has one signature on the Constitution, and that is Alexander Hamilton. Okay. Now we come to a period in the convention because everybody is just presenting plans. Nobody is compromising. Nobody is coming to consensus. Everybody has their own ideas. And what happens to a meeting at some point when that's all that happens? You wonder if anything's going to happen. So we call this the crises period of the convention. And that was from June 19th to July 26th. And it was James Madison then who stood and gave his famous plea entitled, his speech was entitled, "A Constitution for the Ages." And basically he said, gentlemen, we've been together long enough and we've heard enough ideas. Now we need to do something. We will be looked to from ages hence for what we did here. Produce a document that will last for the ages. Just kind of a rallying speech. Well, kind of an effect did it have? Still needed a little more effect, and so, because they were getting no agreements, Madison was finished a little later on, actually. Benjamin Franklin then arose amidst all the quarreling, amidst all the arguing, and when the old sage from Philadelphia, Ben Franklin, stands up, as sickly as he was, everybody listens. And this is Franklin's famous plea for prayer, which is over on page 160 in the first column. By the way, this is one of Franklin's 2 speeches he gave in the convention. The other one had to do with how much we're going to pay public officials. Franklin didn't say a whole lot in the convention, but what he did say was powerful. And this was one of them. And basically, this is what he said, middle of page 160. He said, "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I see, or the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it possible or probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" He goes on to say, "We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." He says, "I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel." And he goes on to describe what will happen if we don't succeed at this convention. Nobody will ever again try this. So he says, we better take this seriously, and we better do something serious. And so he makes a motion. I want you to look at his motion down at the bottom. He says, "I therefore beg leave to move." This is a parliamentary procedure, a motion. "That hereafter prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service." All right, what's he saying? Who should give the prayer?
A priest.
Somebody outside. We need to invite a clergyman to come in to our meeting and offer the prayer. Well, that was his motion. Well, it was customary, as it still is in some times, but it was customary then that if you invite a clergyman to come in, you would pay that clergyman for his service. Guess what there wasn't any of?
Money.
Money in the till. So when they took a vote on this motion, guess what? I mean, it would be fine to say, once they voted to have prayer and started having prayer, everything worked out. But the motion was to invite a clergyman to come in, and they knew they would have to pay the clergyman. And there wasn't any money to pay because most of them were there on borrowed money. And so the motion was defeated. Defeated. Does that mean that they didn't believe in prayer?
No.
No. There just wasn't any money in the till. Now, any one of them could have given a great prayer. We have prayers that a number of them gave or wrote. And so they didn't adopt Franklin's motion. However, Madison writes that from that point on, Franklin's plea seemed to have a sobering effect on the delegates. Whether they prayed in their individual times before they came or whatever, of course we don't know, but that seemed to be still the turning point of the convention. And after that, things really started to happen. Ronnie?
This Isaac tells the story of Mike Christian singing a similar speech, and
Yes, some who have been with us at our simulations have had this same situation. We have these annual simulations that we go to, and I have never seen young people more intense when they have a position and somebody else has another position, and they're both somewhat reasonable, but they have to be talked out and sometimes hotly debated out, and sometimes people don't agree. And I've seen young people your age stand up and say, "I have lived, sir," or something like it, a long time. And we're not going to succeed at this unless we ask the Lord's blessing on our deliberation. And even in a simulation, which is not real, the young people are so into it, it has a sobering effect. And we did see that. Okay. Miracles then began to happen. And one of them was the Connecticut Compromise, which, as you remember, by Roger Sherman, about how the House and the Senate should be structured. That was a big breakthrough, because now you have the small states getting a little bit of what they want, and all of a sudden they're much more agreeable, and then everybody starts to agree. You reach consensus on most points, and you're on your way. Well, after this and a few other agreements, the whole document then was given over to a committee which they formed called the Committee on Detail. And the Committee on Detail met for a number of days and kind of tried to put the thing in order of how a constitution would flow. They gave it back to the convention. The convention adopted a few more things, and then they formed a committee on style. What would you think that would do?
Finish it up.
Yeah, this is the committee that is going to put the Constitution, the document, in its final stylish form. There was a great young lawyer. He was 36 years old on that committee. What was his name?
Gouverneur Morris.
That's correct, Gouverneur Morris. And the Committee on Detail had written a preamble to the Constitution, but it was kind of dull. It said something like, "We the states of," and then it named all the 13 states, or 12 states, whatever it were, "do ordain and establish this Constitution." Is that exciting?
No.
Does that really motivate you to want to read the document? No. And Gouverneur Morris says, we got to have a more exciting document here than this. That is a preamble. And so he wrote the preamble, which for the first time contains the 6 great blessings of a good government. And as you read the preamble, you have to say, gee, did he leave anything out? Can't think of anything. Or is there something there that shouldn't be? It just seems to be just right. That was Gouverneur Morris who wrote the preamble. And after the preamble was written, then of course it was brought back to the full convention that adopted it. And now we come to the famous day of signing, which was on what day? This is kind of interesting, because in the United States we have a holiday to celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's what day? July the 4th. But we have 2 great founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution. And I go around this nation asking people, when is Constitution Day? And hardly anyone knows it.
Don't we have a
Constitution Week.
Or Constitution Week, the beginning of which is Constitution Day, or as Congress has named it, Citizenship Day. It's not a holiday. People don't get off work. And I'm not sure it should be that kind of a holiday, but shouldn't we at least remember it? And we have the privilege right here in Mesa of living in a city that has the oldest ongoing annual celebration of Constitution Week. There's no other city that we know of, and I've been around a lot, in this whole nation that has that. Most of them don't have anything. And not only do we have it, we have an official city committee to celebrate the Constitution every year, and they give us the amphitheater, and So we're lucky to be here and to be celebrating this document every single year. Schools get involved. And anyway, in 1787, September 17th was on a Monday when they all met to sign the document. And they all met to sign it, and 3 of them refused to sign. You remember that? Why did they refuse to sign after all this discussion?
No bill of
3 of
rights.
them refused to sign because, yes, it did not have a Bill of Rights. And do you remember, who was it? George Mason from Virginia. Two of them were from Virginia and one was from Massachusetts.
Said I would rather
George Mason says, "I would rather cut off my right arm than put it to the document without a Bill of Rights." And James Madison said, well, and some of the others says, well, why do you want a Bill of Rights, Mr. Mason? We haven't given the federal government power to violate or to trample on your rights. We've only given them, how many?
20.
A few powers, turns out to be about 20. We haven't given them the power to trample on your rights, your religious rights, your right to press, your right to free speech. That's not even in the powers we've given the federal government in the document. So why do we need to put a Bill of Rights in there? You know what George Mason said? They will.
They did.
They always do.
They did anyway.
It doesn't matter if it isn't in there, the power to trample. They will. Clear back 30 years before, Franklin had come up with a plan of union. It was called the Albany Plan. Remember that one in your history? Albany Plan. 30 years before. And he had tried several times in the intervening years to try to bring them together. And finally, it had happened. And here he was, 81 years old. Only lived less than 2 years more. So this was the climax of his life. This was the highlight of his life. And he's crying as he's signing the document. And a few places in the school, you'll notice we have a poster with Franklin signing, a little tear coming down, entitled "The Old Man Wept." Well, if you go to Philadelphia, which we did last May, and go into Independence Hall, and you see the chair that Washington sat in, still there. And you can actually see the carving on the back of the chair. And Franklin said, and by the way, the carving is that of a sun, but it's not a whole sun, it's just a half of a sun, it's on a horizon. And you don't know by looking at it whether it's rising or setting. And Franklin, very last thing at the convention, made this comment.
The sun is rising.
He said, "I have often in the course of the session," this is on page 162, second column, "looked at the sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." In other words, Franklin was expressing what? Great hope. This is a monumental undertaking. And he also made the comment before this, he says, "I'm not sure it's the best, but I'm not sure it's not the best." And that ended the Constitutional Convention. What Washington and Madison both later said was a miracle. For so many men to come together and do this was just a miracle. Most of the miraculous things happening the last few weeks of the convention. Okay, that ends the convention. Thank you very much.